Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the first episode of the fifth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. And this is just one piece of the important work that the Center is doing at the intersection of religion, American culture, and the most pressing issues of today. The last season was engaging in a far-reaching set of conversations that covered religion and the public intellectual, religion and hip hop, and ended last May on religion and comics. And I wanted to thank our panelists and hosts for those topics and many more that we covered. If you didn't get a chance to catch them, please check them out on our YouTube channel. And they have been updated with show resources so that you can check out those episodes as well as follow information about the topics that were discussed by our thinkers and our thought provocateurs. Today, I want to invite you in for the first half of this first season, as we have purposefully curated a set of episodes that will allow us to explore some of the most pressing debates, issues, and controversies through the lens of religion and American culture. We have asked each of our panelists to not only engage the way that these topics and questions are shaping the field of religious studies and American studies, but to engage a broader audience, right? To think about the students, the concerned citizens, and the engaged policymakers as they think through questions and terms and the implications of these topics. From today's engagement on anti-Semitism to next month's engagement on Islamophobia, we are squarely addressing the issues that are facing our campuses and our larger society. And we have asked our panelists to think about these groups and to think about these topics as they have submitted teaching resources and ideas and questions for each of these episodes. And for this episode, I want folks to know we already have a treasure trove of teaching resources already listed. So if you go to our website, you can see syllabi and talks and videos already available for you to continue this conversation that we are going to begin today. I want everybody to remember that throughout today's session, we have disabled the chat feature, but we are asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our host and our panelists to engage these questions and to facilitate this very important conversation. Today, our host and our panelists are going to give us a deeper introduction, but I just want to remind us that we're starting off thinking about anti-Semitism today, its deep roots in American history, and the way that it has continued to shape and inform popular and political culture. Today, our panelists are going to be discussing this long history of anti-Semitism and how the fields of religious studies and American religious history think through the significance of this particular form of discrimination and violence in relationship to the rest of American history. I promise you, we have brought together a group of thinkers and real powerful thought leaders who are really going to help us think through this topic and really push us forward as we unpack this. I would like to start off by introducing our host for this afternoon's discussion, Dr. John Turner and Dr. Lincoln Mullen. Lincoln Mullen is a professor of history at George Mason University and the executive director of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. He is the author of The Chance of Salvation, A History of Conversion in America, America's Public Bible, a commentary, and most recently, Antisemitism, U.S.A, a history, which is also a part of a podcast series that he will talk a little bit more about during this afternoon's discussion. In addition to Lincoln, we have Dr. John Turner, who teaches and writes about the place of religion in American history. He came to George Mason University in 2012 after earning a PhD in history from University of Notre Dame and a Master's of Divinity from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He is the author of several books, including Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, and They Knew They Were Pilgrims from Yale University Press in 2020. And he's also been a participant in co-writing the scripts for Antisemitism U.S.A., the podcast that he and Lincoln both work on. I want you to join me in welcoming Lincoln and John to Religion and I will hand it over them to introduce the rest of our august panel and to begin this very important conversation.
Thanks, Joseph. That was a super nice introduction. Thanks for having us this afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing the other two members of our panel. Sarah Imhoff is professor of religious studies at Indiana University. She's the author of two great books, Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism, and The Lives of Jesse Samter, Queer Disabled Zionists, the latter of which appeared 2 years ago from Duke University Press. And Britt Tevis is Phyllis Backer Professor of American Jewish History at Syracuse University. She earned not only a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but also a JD, and she's written widely about the intersection of anti-Semitism and American legal history. Just 1 minute on the background of the podcast, which I encourage you to check out wherever you find podcasts or at r2studios.org. Lincoln and I started working on this series in 2022. We recruited Britt as the show's lead researcher. And as a not insignificant bonus, she suggested the title Antisemitism U.S.A. Raising a podcast takes a village, or in this case, producers, writers, publicists, and a large number of scholars and others whom we interviewed for the series. Now on to the substance of today's panel. I've got the first question. Let's start with the state of the field in terms of the history of American anti-Semitism. How have historians and other scholars addressed the history of anti-Semitism in the United States? And are there trends in that scholarship that we might be able to observe?
I'll jump right in on this one. And I first want to say thank you so much to Joseph for hosting all of us, and also to John and Lincoln for recruiting me and giving me the opportunity to be in conversation with scholars such as Sarah and others. This has been really an amazing experience for me. So thank you for including me. As far as the field of anti-Semitism studies in the United States, or studies of anti-Semitism in the United States, there are really, I think, two roads that scholars have walked down. One is within the field of American Jewish history, and that has been the primary field that has addressed this subject. And in that field, the scholar Tony Michaels has told us and has written very convincingly about the notion of American Jewish exceptionalism, which places American Jewish history apart from Jewish history in Europe, and states that American Jewish history is different. And one of the major ways it's different, according to this framework, is that anti-Semitism in America has not really been a genuine phenomenon. Yes, there may be stray anti-Semitic incidents here and there. We can probably, at least historians can probably, name the top 5, maybe even the top 10, but those are outliers. And that's what makes America exceptional, especially, again, vis-a-vis Europe, which is traditionally treated as a monolithic entity. Outside of the field of American Jewish history, there are scholars who have written, and historians specifically, who have written about anti-Semitism in the United States. And because they are not wed to this notion of American Jewish exceptionalism, they tend to produce, to my mind, much more robust and meaningful studies, and have taken anti-Semitism much more seriously in many cases. So those are the two major kind of mountains of work that exist. All of which is to say, though, that there isn't a tremendous amount of scholarship about the field. I hate to say there's a silver lining from this moment, but I suppose one silver lining is that I think there's a real shift going on right now, and people are starting to take interest. I mean, the podcast is obviously indicative of the scholarly shift, and so that's something to look forward to, learning more.
Yeah, I would say also that very few scholars of American Jewish history would have told you there's no such thing as anti-Semitism. And one thing that they, I think, have done well is thought about anti-Semitism contextually. So I think about, I don't know, studies of like the most famous incident, I think, which is the Leo Frank case. And many American Jewish historians have written about this, and they're often quite attentive to, the best ones are quite attentive to the other dynamics that are going on. So class dynamics, what it means North versus South, what it means to have a workplace that involves both children and adults and white people and Black people. And so I do think there are some things to be said in favor of some of that existing scholarship, which is that when we don't necessarily go asking just for anti-Semitism and looking just for anti-Semitism, if what we're looking for is a bigger picture of Jewish history, we can end up with more nuanced pictures. And if I'm going to sing one tune today, it's going to be that when we think about anti-Semitism, we do our best thinking when we're thinking contextually rather than some abstracted, like I'm worried about the narrative of anti-Semitism as the longest hatred, as if it's one thing forever in every place. And I think that that's one thing we can say that American Jewish historians have been relatively good at, is to contextualize anti-Semitism within a time and a place. And I can see how that may sometimes lead toward an American Jewish exceptionalism, which of course goes beyond just issues of anti-Semitism, that narrative.
And my sense is that, well, I think everybody on this panel was already thinking about the history of anti-Semitism before the last couple of years. I think going back 8 or 10 years, there does seem to be fresh concern among scholars to address the subject, to figure out how to integrate it into larger narratives. So what is sort of behind that I would say fresh interest, which I think very much predates the prior year?
I'll jump in on a few places there, and then turn it back over to Britt and to Sarah. I think historians tell histories for a purpose. It's not just about the past, it's about what we're trying to say here in the present. And as concerns in the present have changed, historians pay attention to different parts in the past. And I think the concern in telling the history of American Jewish history in previous times has been to explain why the United States has been a place of opportunity for Jewish Americans. Not that it's a retelling of the myth of the Golden Medina, but there's an element in which telling stories about the United States and about Jewish history place in it is intended to create a kind of understanding of the United States as being a place that is open to American Jews. But I think there is, generally speaking, in the telling of American history in the past decade, as you indicated, John, a renewed interest in looking at the hard parts of American history. We're well past the consensus history period. We're well past the Whig history periods. One example that has really resonated in popular consciousness is the 1619 Project, which attempts to tell the origin story of the United States, not in independence in 1776 or some other time, but in the arrival of the first enslaved people in the United States. And I think that kind of focus on the hard parts of American history and understanding how they are at the root of the American story has very much been a part of popular history making and academic history making as it relates to the history of race and racism. And I think, by analogy, something similar is going on with the history of anti-Semitism, that there has been the opportunity to focus on the the difficult parts of the history of anti-Semitism in the United States, not exactly as the same thing as race and racism, although obviously racism and anti-Semitism are linked in very important ways that we talk about in the podcast, but by analogy as a difficult history that needs to be told. And then we shouldn't just escape the obvious, like in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. That caught a lot of people's attention. It certainly caught mine. The shootings at the Tree of Life synagogues, those are now several years behind us, and there has been time for scholars who have seen those things to delve into and research a little bit more deeply. Although many people, including Sarah and Britt, were working on that for longer than that.
Yeah, thanks, Lincoln. I very much agree, and would say I would also link it to some other wider cultural questions. The visibility of Black Lives Matter, of Standing Rock, of people in communities, not just academics, looking to places like structure and like power dynamics to explain the situatedness of people. Those are conversations that have increased across the US, I think, and also in Jewish communities. And one of the questions for many Jewish communities, it's a live question, is where do we see ourselves with respect to these things? Do we see ourselves on this side or on that side? What does it mean to be a people who has both experienced immense privilege in the United States and a people who has experienced racism, anti-Jewish hatred that is religious, and other kinds of things? How do we want to tell our story? How do we fit into these contemporary events that we're seeing? And so I think you can see that from a variety of political positions and also ideas about which history is our history. So all of this to say, yes, Lincoln, and I think it's a live question in Jewish communities. And so that then becomes a question for scholars. Jewish communities are asking these questions about our history. These are things that we as scholars should think about attending to. How do we tell this story carefully and well?
I have nothing to add to that. I endorse both of those answers fully. I couldn't put it better.
Thanks, Britt. Since we're in a religion and series here, I thought I'd ask a couple of anti-Semitism and questions to different panelists. So I'm going to ask, what's the relationship between the study of anti-Semitism and political rights, citizenship, emancipation? As we think about those histories, and Britt, I wonder if you could take that one. And then I want to try to understand how anti-Semitism is connected to the history of race. And Sarah, I wonder if you could take that one, please. And then, there's lots of different religious groups that are connected with anti-Semitism, but I thought we'd talk about religion specifically through evangelicalism and how evangelicalism is tied into anti-Semitism. So picking up what Sarah said earlier about context, we have the geographic context, we have the chronological context. What is the context of anti-Semitism in these other kinds of histories? Britt, do you think you could tell us about anti-Semitism and politics and emancipation?
So I should say that this is my answer, but I think if you ask another historian, you might get another answer, which is fine. I love the fact that historians—
That's why we got 4 historians here.
That's right. I love the fact that historians disagree with each other. And, there's a part of my Alan Brinkley textbook when I was in high school, historians disagree. So I like that. And that's what makes our job fun. But my answer to this question about the relationship between the study of anti-Semitism and political rights is that I take the view that the subject of Jewish emancipation, which is the process through which Jews gained and lost rights globally, starting, the historian David Sorkin tells us, around 500 years ago. That story also takes place in the United States, and the underbelly of the story, the part of the story when the rights are being clawed back and away from Jews, that's the anti-Semitism, which is to say that anti-Semitism, in my estimation, is best understood as a political program aimed at denying Jews full access to political and civil rights. And the moments when we see that happening, and this manifests in a variety of ways, from violence, which is the denial of one's ultimate right to be alive. But also we see it, for example, in the denial of the right to serve on a jury. Just this summer, I saw there had been systematic exclusion of Jews from juries in Northern California through 2008. So that's even in the 21st century, that's still ongoing. So as far as rights and citizenship, we can think of when the rights of citizenship and the capacity to exercise one's full citizenship as a Jew, that is what constitutes anti-Semitism. So it's the opposite of emancipation.
Britt, can I just ask a kind of a follow-up there? If I went to one of my students and I talked about emancipation in U.S. history, they would, of course, think 1860 Civil War, the emancipation of enslaved people. Can you help us think about that term emancipation? I know it's a term that is used in Jewish studies. It is less familiar outside of that particular area, although how should we think about those two things together?
So the word emancipation, I think, is apt and useful because it describes the process through which, when nation states came into being, these newly formed countries asked themselves, who should have rights here? In a similar fashion that, after the American Civil War and America's second founding, right, there are ongoing conversations about whether or not African Americans ought to have rights. And in the same exact moment, and this wasn't the first time in the United States, conversations about whether Jews should have rights and which rights should be afforded to them are taking place as well. So this conversation, again, emancipation is a term that can be used in both contexts, insofar as we should be thinking about rights and who deserves rights, and whether or not there's going to be a full granting of rights by the nation state.
Great, thanks, Britt. Sarah, do you think you could talk to us a little bit about the relationship between the study of anti-Semitism and the study of race?
Yeah, so if Britt emphasized the ways that we might think similarly about African-American experiences and Jewish experiences, I think it's really important to start with a major difference. And that is, in North American contexts, it was never possible to enslave European descent Jews, whereas it was for Native Americans and African Americans. That 18th century legislation that talks about any white person, nobody ever asks if that includes Jews because they all think it does. That doesn't mean that Jews are equal in every way, but it does mean that we don't want to just lump Jews in with all other racialized people. We don't even want to lump, there is no all other racialized people, right? We want to be quite particular when we think about the different histories here. And so I think that's another good example of the way that I would frame anti-Semitism as, I don't know, an ugly pot that sometimes gets filled more with one thing and sometimes gets filled more with the other thing. And sometimes somebody takes I don't really like okra. Somebody takes the okra out and somebody else puts, something inedible in it, right? And that we end up with different, poison stew. This is a terrible metaphor, I'm sorry. In different moments. And so in those colonial moments, I think that poison stew is made up of many more religious elements. For example, when Stuyvesant is trying to keep the Jews out in 1654, he calls them blasphemers of Christ's name. He is also cranky with Lutherans and Quakers at the same time. He wants them all out of his little fiefdom, right? So all of that to say is, at that moment, there is a real religious piece to the anti-Semitism that is, I think, the central part. We also have good evidence that in many colonial times, in many contexts in colonial times, if you were Jewish and white and converted to Christianity, the stigmas and even rights were often accrued to you just as if you were a Christian person, and certainly to the children. And so in that way, we can see ways that anti-Semitism is not always exactly about race. However, sometimes it's more about race. I would say by the early 20th century, that's a good example of a moment where race is on a lot of people's minds, in part because of immigration. What's the racial makeup of the United States? People wanted to know. And in that moment, I think it's a really important moment to think about. European descent Jews are at once considered white and objects of of anti-Semitic racism, so or racist anti-Semitism, however you want to think about that. But that anti-Semitism does have a significant racial component, and that is an idea that there are multiple white races, and Jews are a little farther down on the list of white races. There are a few people who say Jews aren't white, but they seem to be the minority. There are many people who think Jews are their own race. There are also many people who think they're part of a bigger race of people called Semites. The people who think that Jews are their own race and or Semites, some of them are Jews themselves, and it's not internalized hatred, it's just a really different racial map than the one we have, which again gets us back to this idea that really understanding the historical moment and the racial constructions is key to understanding how anti-Semitism and racism are intersecting in each one of these moments, because it's different at different moments in American history.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. John, could you talk to us, please, about the relationship between anti-Semitism and evangelicalism?
I mean, could we do a whole webinar on that? I mean, evangelicals have just been a tangle of confusing and shifting ideas about Jews, both negative and positive. And, you know, that term evangelical, it's so slippery, but I'll just use it straightforwardly. Especially until recently, evangelicals have been at the forefront of American efforts to convert Jews, in part because many understood Jews as fulfilling prophecies connected to the second coming of Christ. The events of the late 1940s and also 1967 were therefore thrilling to many evangelicals. I remember a story about a somewhat prominent evangelical leader who was a seminary student in the late 1940s. And when he heard about the establishment of the modern state of Israel, he decided he didn't want to go to class anymore because he didn't want to be studying Hebrew and Greek when Christ returned. And I don't think he was dashing off to brush up on Aramaic either. I would encourage anyone to listen to the 8th episode of Antisemitism, U.S.A., in which we explore Billy Graham's conversations with Richard Nixon about Jews. Much of what Graham says could come right out of the 1930s from Gerald Winrod or even from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I think Graham is in many ways a good representative of evangelical trends during these decades. Public and probably genuine enthusiasm for Israel and to some extent for Jews, but at the same time, a lot of private discomfort and prejudice. Actually, I think I'm going right from an answer to the next question, but I'll just take a moment to say that if you have a question, we'd love it if you would put it into the Q&A feature, and we will try to raise some of those questions up in a little bit. But it occurred to me we are here to talk about religion and anti-Semitism, and we talked a little bit about evangelicals. But if anti-Semitism has many roots, from scientific racism to political exclusion to conspiracy theories, what are the particularly ongoing influences of religion specifically on anti-Semitism?
I'll try to jump in and give an overview answer here. I think that as the kinds of anti-Semitism in the United States, different strains of anti-Semitism in the United States have changed over time, we can go back and find Christian anti-Semitism as one of the very earliest strata of that. I mean, Sarah has already mentioned Peter Stuyvesant, and that's one of the earliest examples of anti-Semitism in North America. Looking a little closer to the United States as opposed to British North America and the colonies, let's just try on a few different things here. So one thing that I think is pretty obvious is that lots of Christians in, say, the early Republic think they know a tremendous amount about Jews without ever having met a Jew. This has been captured really succinctly by Jonathan Sarna in the title of an essay called "The Mythical Jew and the Jew Next Door." I see my co-panelists reciting the title with me. It's a really great way of thinking about what's going on there. That Christians read about Jews in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. They read about them in the New Testament. A lot of what they read from the Bible is not flattering, and so they have this fascination, which borders often on obsession with Jews, or at least can. And they feel like they understand Jews a whole lot better than Jews understand themselves. It's actually like in early America, it's like pretty hard to meet a Jewish person. If you're not in Philadelphia, if you're not in Charleston, if you're not in a few other sort of places where Jews have settled, it's not the easiest thing. That will change later on with bigger waves of immigration, but still even at the peak, Jews are a single-digit percentage of the U.S. population. So that lends itself to a Christian way of thinking about Jews in stereotypes, and to a kind of it's almost like Orientalism in a certain kind of a way, but a kind of a fascination with Jews in a sense that they are um, uh, really well known to Christians without actually being known. Another way that I would talk about this is that Christians are pretty good at organizing, and oftentimes they organize for the purpose of trying to convert Jews. So in episode 2 of the podcast, we talk about the American Society for Ameliorating the Condition of the Jews, which was just a very thin veil over trying to convert Jews. There are plenty of other societies that were founded at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, American Missions to the Jews and so forth. These continue throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. There's all kinds of examples of Christians trying to get Jews converted to Christianity. And the early republic is really about, are they able to be citizens? Like, if Christianity, if virtue, morality is essential to being a citizen, where do you get that from? Well, you have to be Christian, and so you can't be Jewish. And that's a big part of the emancipation struggle that Britt was mentioning earlier. These organizations, I don't think, are successful at converting Jews in any significant numbers, but they do put that kind of pressure on. And what they are really good is at organizing Christians to believe that they are going after the conversion of Jews. There's a few examples of like fisticuffs between Jews in Chicago and missionaries and so forth, but by and large, it's that sort of overarching pressure. Another thing, we could say is the presence of the apocalyptic within American Christianity is very strong. John's already talked about the importance of the end times prophecies and thinking about the state of Israel. But that is a constant even before the state of Israel is founded. Christians think about Jews in apocalyptic end times terms, and that's a part of that sort of stereotyping of Jews. In our episode, I think it's episode 5 about conspiracy theories, we spent a lot of time talking about Henry Ford and the way that he popularized conspiratorial text about Jews. But we could have spent just as much time talking about Father Charles Coughlin, the Catholic radio priest who, once you finish Antisemitism U.S.A., only then are you allowed to go download Forward's podcast about Charles Coughlin and the history of his anti-Semitism. But there's like a religiously motivated thing there. Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, changed Catholic teaching about the relationship between Christians and Jews, away from charges of deicide. But that's 1960s, and it takes a long time for that to percolate down through the Catholic Church. The official Christian teaching, at least within Roman Catholicism, about Jews' role in the crucifixion of Jesus, and the texts that Christians read around Easter or other sort of times, it just is productive of a kind of a Christian way of thinking anti-Semitically. I could probably go on, but I should stop there.
Can I just add briefly to how
Please.
those sentiments? Well, first of all, I assigned just a few weeks ago that the mythical Jew next door to my students. It's a great article. Great article. I highly endorse that Sarna piece. But I just wanted to just that can tick off a few examples of the ways that the sentiments that you were just noting manifest in American law. So just by way of example, in the 19th century, we saw the passage of Sunday closing laws. And in some cases, the passage of those laws were being advanced and advocated by people as explicitly Christian laws and the importance of incorporating Christianity into the state. And in some cases, specifically to deter Jews from moving to, for example, California or moving to certain regions as a way to say, we know this will be economically detrimental to you, and we don't want you here because you are morally inferior to us. And I say us, the giving Christian population. But we also see these sentiments as they appear in, mandatory readings of King James Bibles in public school, and really just any place that we see the merging of church and state is the legal manifestation, I think, of the ideas that you were just talking about.
Not to beleaguer this for a long time, but just to put in a plug for religious studies as a really useful way, I think, for thinking about the conspiracy theories too. I think the tools that a religion scholar can bring to asking questions about, say, QAnon are really, in fact, incredibly helpful. So I would just sort of think, when we're thinking about the rubric, we might even add the conspiracy theories into the religion pile, not necessarily because they are religion, but because the same set of tools can be really good for analyzing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I just taught a course where a big part of it was about QAnon as a kind of an American scripture, and the relationship between that and anti-Semitism, I think, is productive. Not the same thing, but productive for thinking about. Okay, we're drawing towards the end of our time here before we turn to Q&A, and I'll just remind folks that if you use the Q&A function there and type a question to us, the panelists will start to answer those fairly soon. But coming down more closely to the present, since October 7th, 2023, popular discussion has focused on the line between anti-Israel activism and anti-Semitism, which thus involves defining the term anti-Semitism. I think, Sarah's just mentioned religious studies. I think we can think about this by way of analogy. Religious studies scholars, to a first approximation, spend their time trying to define what religion is. And I think that's a productive discussion about as a way of thinking about what that definition is. So how can we use this popular concern about defining anti-Semitism, about drawing lines, about where anti-Semitism is in our scholarship, in our classroom, in order to advance a useful and historically informed understanding of anti-Semitism?
I'll just note that's there's a similar question in the Q&A asking us to discuss the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The first thing I think I would say is that this connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism isn't new. I'm thinking of Naomi Cohen's book, The Americanization of Zionism, about the vitriol that the at first small number of American Zionists received from officials in the State Department, from academics and others in the early decades of the 20th century, who argued that Zionism amounted to dual loyalty and an international conspiracy against not only Arabs, but against other countries as well. In the 9th episode of Antisemitism U.S.A., we focus on what's changed on college campuses over the past 25 years. We don't try to define a precise line where anti-Israel ideas or rhetoric crosses into anti-Semitism. Obviously, that's an enormous subject of debate, which you can see not precisely in competing definitions of anti-Semitism, but in the examples that accompany those definitions. So instead, we try to make a more simple argument, which is simply that the success of anti-Zionist and anti-Israel movements has created space, so fertile soil for anti-Semitism. as the anti-Israel movement gained traction on campuses, incidents of anti-Semitism grew. And I see this as causation rather than simply correlation. I just had a discussion with a group of students in a class earlier this afternoon about the defacing of Judaic studies posters at my university with terms like genocide. And, you know, students had, Jewish and non-Jewish students had a range of ideas about when it was appropriate to label specific things anti-Semitism or not. But I think almost everyone would agree that there has been a lot of change over the last 20 years. And so we try to trace that change rather than try to define a precise line.
I just want to say, John, thank you so much for articulating the idea that while not all anti-Israel sentiment is necessarily anti-Semitic, there has been a rise in anti-Semitic sentiments in spaces where we see a rise of anti-Israel sentiment. I don't think I've seen many academics go on record to say that. So I've heard it said, but not certainly not on a Zoom recording. So I appreciate that observation very much. And that's all. I just want to say thank you for saying that.
I want to add something else that I think often gets collapsed here, and that is that there is, and always has been, as long as there has been Zionism, there has been Jewish anti-Zionism. And I also want to mark that it's that the collapsing of these two is also putting pressure on significant portions of Jewish communities who say, we have critiques of Israel, but we're now being told that being anti-Zionist is not a thing you can be if you are Jewish, because being Jewish in this moment means supporting Israel. So that this move to collapse anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is also putting pressure on Jews. It's also putting pressure on Jews who might say, like, well, I feel like I am sometimes critical of Israel, but I am also worried about expressing that because that is a thing that I am told that anti-Semites do, and I don't want to be that person. So it's interesting to me that at that same moment when the State Department is suspicious and pushing back against Zionists, so is the reform movement. Like, the reform movement is saying those same things. We're not a nation state. We shouldn't be a nation state. We stopped that a long time ago. We're a religion. The reform movement does move its position on that, but that's a very strongly articulated position for the reform movement from the 19th century to the early 20th century. So this is, again, a real call for us paying attention to the full context. I also notice sometimes people want to say, well, we're not sure where the line is between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but if you say the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist, then you're an anti-Semite. But again, that's one where we need more political information. There are plenty of people who have made the argument that no nation state on its face has a right to exist. And then that's not an anti-Semitic position to say this one doesn't, because none of them do. So I want to make sure that when we think about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, we don't start from the default position of, oh, these are always going together. They have historically always been together. Most people didn't know or care about Zionism in the early 20th century, and many Jews included in that. And yet we can point to places that there's plenty of anti-Semitism at that moment. So I want to be very careful to say that anti-Zionism should not always be a red flag for us. It should not always be a pointer. It shouldn't always just make us ask the next question, is this anti-Semitic? Instead, we should be asking more questions to understand what that position entails, if we're going to engage it thoughtfully. And I think, so one way that I think sometimes anti-Semitism can be a conversation stopper is when it becomes, oh, well, the first thing we need to know about anything is whether it's anti-Semitic. That is not a good way to begin dialogue or to begin historical inquiry. And so learning more information about those various positions, because we know that there are plenty of anti-Zionist positions held by Jews and non-Jews that are not anti-Semitic. And so as much as this is a podcast or as a presentation about the importance of anti-Semitism, I also don't want it to be used as a conversation stopper in that way.
Can I just add that I think, generally speaking, that academics have actually been quite sophisticated in talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the way that Sarah just endorsed, and I wish perhaps that more political leadership engaged in conversations in this way. To my mind, unfortunately, an outcome I think Sarah was gesturing towards is that we have seen anti-Semitism used as a Trojan horse for smuggling in just all other political positions and using it as she said, as a conversation stopper, as if, which is in and of itself quite troubling to me, because what that ends up doing is trivializing anti-Semitism when there is real anti-Semitism that is a real problem and needs to be treated seriously, and not used as a way to kind of trick other people into endorsing alternative political policies.
I don't know if I'm allowed to answer my own question, but I'm going to jump in on a point that I think comes alongside what Sarah was just saying. So the question of pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli activism is one that's deeply connected to history. And we could probably debate in talking to any given person how accurate or nuanced their understanding of the history of the state of Israel is. However, what I generally find in talking to students or other people who are involved in these movements is that they are unaware of the histories of the activism itself. Certainly Sarah was talking about that earlier with the questions of Jewish versions of anti-Zionism. But for example, in I think episode 9 of the podcast, we go into the history of the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement. So the people who are engaged in these political disputes may know about the history that they are arguing about, but I generally find that they're unaware of the history of their own movement. And so talking about the institutional context, the reasons that has come about, and so forth, is a way of helping people to understand where these activist impulses come from, but also where the anti-Semitism that is so often attended with them comes as well.
So I'm gonna lift up another question from the Q&A, asking us to speak to the I think intersection of anti-Semitism or the reality of anti-Semitism, but then other bigotry toward Jews who are not white, namely Latino, Latina, Latin American communities. And the questioner has particular hope that Sarah might be able to speak to this, but that doesn't mean anybody else can't either.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. In the US, there are a bunch of complicating factors. One of these interesting demographic complicating factors is some of the people who identify as both Jewish and Latinx are either Cuban refugees or descendants of Cuban refugees, who you might know have tended to vote more reliably Republican, which makes them unlike many other people in Jewish communities. And so in that case, there can be a friction or a sense from other Jews that you're not doing Jewishness right, or you're not like us, or there can be straight up racism internal to the Jewish community, and with the sense that real Jews are white, right? So there can be that internal racism. We also see racism within Jewish communities toward many Jews of color. I think it's really hard to find a Black Jew in the US who doesn't have a story of being asked why they're at the synagogue. So there is this sense within many Jewish communities, not every single person, but an overall sense that this is what Jews look like. And if you look different, you need to account for your difference somehow. And that can be true too for Latinx Jews or Latin Jews. So there's an interesting sociological book by Laura Limonik called Frijoles and Kugel, or those in some permutation, those two things. And that's a relatively recent sociological book about Latinx Jews mainly in Southern Florida. And you can see both of those things acting, sometimes both of those things being racism and anti-Semitism, sometimes acting together, sometimes acting apart from one another, sometimes internal to the community, sometimes Jewish community, sometimes beyond. So if you're interested in a reading recommendation, that might be a good one for you.
I'll ask another question from the Q&A, and please feel free to submit any other questions that you have through that if you would like. So this question is, why does the term anti-Semitism continue to be used in popular parlance instead of anti-Jewishness, or I suppose any other sort of synonyms we could use? And the person goes on to ask, what's the value of continuing with such terminology? Britt, do you think you might want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to the longer history of that term. So the term itself, the term anti-Semitism emerges and it's popularized in the late 1870s in Germany during conversations in the newly formed countries. Germany unifies in 1871 during conversations about who deserves rights in this new country. And there was a journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr who was very determined that Jews should not gain rights in this newly constituted country. And he was so determined about this that he decided to start a club, and he named this club the Anti-Semites, based on a racialized understanding and connection between the speakers of certain languages, and a category he understood to be Semitic. And Hebrew speakers were in that category, and Arabic speakers were also in that category. So he had a club, he had a publication about anti-Semites. One thing to know is that the label stuck, and it soon became used beyond the context of Germany. It spread very quickly within 10 years throughout Western Europe and then into the United States, where derivatives of the term appeared, things like political anti-Semitism, economic anti-Semitism. The term itself became attached specifically to Jews very soon after it initially appeared. And I should say there is currently ongoing debate about, and I should also add that in its initial iteration, the word had a hyphen between anti and Semites, and Semites were capitalized, the S was capitalized. And part of the longer history of this term has involved the removal of that hyphen and turning that capital S into a lowercase s. And as that transition happened, anti-Semitism became distinctly known as an anti-Jewish hatred. There is a very, I think, tiny but a movement among certain intellectuals to reintroduce that hyphen to the term and recapitalize the S for Semites as a way to show solidarity with essentially Muslims and create some sort of political alliance. I personally find that to be not something I'm compelled to do, insofar as I think it's useful to have a term to talk about anti-Jewish discrimination, bigotry, and violence. I'm similarly not a fan of the term people of color, insofar as it obscures more than it illuminates. I like terms that help me understand things. And so I like terms that are specific and meant to, describe a particular category of people. And it's not useful to me to lump two groups of people who have rather distinct histories together merely for contemporary political purposes. So I think that its persistence is both a fact of its usefulness in the modern era to describe the desire to deny Jews rights. And built into it is also an understanding about Jews and race. And that's another reason why the term is particularly useful, especially beginning the late 19th century onwards.
Thank you, Britt. I'm just going to add one sort of practical note. Like when writing the podcast, we didn't have any trouble with using synonyms like anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Jewish bigotry or so forth. But there is one very specific way in which the term anti-Semitism is useful, which is plenty of anti-Semites don't think that they are anti-Jewish. In fact, they think that they are pro-Jewish in some way because they have what they believe to be positive stereotypes about Jews, but they are thinking stereotypically about Jews and not actually understanding Jews as they are, nor are they, in my view, genuine allies of Jews. So talking, for instance, about Billy Graham, as John mentioned, and his anti-Semitic rant with Richard Nixon, Billy Graham thinks of himself as a friend of the Jews, and perhaps in certain ways was, but he very definitely was an anti-Semite in those conversations, and it's just a more useful term in those contexts.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents is it's useful because people recognize it. It's because that's the word that regular people use. And therefore it makes communicating easier. I think it has the distinct problem of being tenuous in pre-modern eras. I have in this podcast talked about anti-Semitism in the 17th century. I don't know that I would write that in a scholarly book, and I surely wouldn't talk about anti-Semitism in the ancient world, even though we can point to places where people persecuted Jews. So I think it does come with that 19th century baggage, which might be a reasonable way for us to continue to talk about it in the present day. But I do think that makes it a really pretty modern term. And for scholarly reasons, I agree with what I think is the spirit of that question, which is this really the best term that we could be using? Like if we were inventing one today that we could just agree that everyone already understood, I'm not sure this is the one I would go for.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. We had the advantage of, working on a podcast that mostly transpired in 19th, 20th, early 21st century America. So I totally agree with what you just said, Sarah. It's just using the term, I mean, we maybe used it a little bit anachronistically for some of the early decades, but yeah, we have to be careful. I mean, similar concerns about the word evangelical before around 1945. It just doesn't, it's not the way what people were using back then.
Well, we are coming up on time here, and our hosts have instructed us to keep to a strict time limit. I really want to thank the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture for inviting the 4 of us to do this. There's a few things we want you to know as we're finishing up here. In the chat, you should receive a link that will have a short survey. Please go ahead and fill that out and let the center know about other topics you'd like to see. You'll also get this in your email shortly, so please look for that. Next month is Religion and Islamophobia, so I'll be joining for that one. Please take a look at the schedule coming up for this season of what's a really exciting Religion and series this semester. And then finally, in due time, a recording of this webinar will be available on the center's YouTube, RacTube, and I believe that will also be in the emails that will be going out to you. And if not, you can find it on the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture's website. Finally, I'd be remiss not to say r2studios.org if you'd like to listen to the Antisemitism U.S.A. podcast. Thanks again to our hosts, and thank you, Britt, Sarah, and John, for doing this with us today.